It was a bright, sunny day in a beautiful city that was known for its stunning historical landmarks and rich royal heritage. The streets were busy with tourists, each eager to experience the grandeur of the place. Among them was a young, wealthy tourist named Daniel, who was visiting from another country. He had always felt like the world was his playground, a place where he could do anything he wanted without consequences. His family's wealth and reputation made him feel invincible. Wherever he went, people would recognize him, admire him, and open doors for him. Daniel was walking through the city's royal district, admiring the grandeur of the buildings around him. The air was filled with the scent of fresh flowers, and the cobblestone streets reflected the sun's rays. He had been to many countries, and he was no stranger to the way royal families and their guards were treated with great respect. But that day, something about the regal atmosphere seemed to awaken his mischievous side. As he wandered through the streets, he noticed something that caught his attention: one of the royal guards standing at attention in front of the royal palace. The guard, dressed in an elegant uniform, stood still like a statue, his face expressionless, and his posture perfect. He looked like someone who had spent years training to maintain such discipline. The royal guards were famous for their stoic presence, and their job was to protect the royal family and their heritage. To Daniel, the guard was just another part of the royal scenery, a figure who was there to be admired. But to him, this was a chance for a bit of fun. He had always loved pulling pranks on people, and today, he thought, why not have a little fun at the expense of the royal tradition? With a mischievous grin on his face, Daniel pulled a small can of paint from his backpack. He had picked it up earlier that day when he saw a nearby shop selling it, thinking it might come in handy for some artistic expression. He could already imagine the laughter and the amusement that would follow. He quickly shook the can, making sure the paint would spray smoothly, and without hesitation, he aimed it at the royal guard. In an instant, the paint hit the guard's pristine uniform, splashing across the bright fabric and leaving a bold streak of color. The sight of it made Daniel laugh out loud, but he quickly looked around to see if anyone had noticed his act of mischief. Some nearby tourists had seen the whole thing, and their faces showed shock and disbelief. A few started to pull out their phones to record what had just happened. Daniel, though, didn't think much of it. He was enjoying the moment, unaware of how badly things might turn out. The royal guard, who had been completely still until that moment, didn't move a muscle. His face remained expressionless, but there was no mistaking the shift in his eyes. He had seen the tourist's actions, and he knew what this could mean. The guard didn't react or say anything. He simply turned to one of his fellow guards and gave a slight nod. His calm demeanor only made Daniel feel even more confident, as he thought that this little prank would go unpunished. After all, what could happen to him? He was rich and powerful. He could buy his way out of any trouble. But as Daniel continued to walk away, smiling to himself, he didn't realize that the consequences of his actions were about to begin. What seemed like a harmless prank to him was about to spiral into something much bigger than he could have ever imagined. The people around him, though, had seen enough. Their expressions began to shift from surprise to anger. They had witnessed something that they considered to be deeply disrespectful to not only the guard, but to the royal family and the history that the guard represented. It was at that moment that Daniel's carelessness began to set off a chain of events that would change his life forever. The moment Daniel threw the paint on the royal guard, he felt a rush of excitement, thinking he had pulled off the perfect prank. But as he looked around, the faces of the nearby tourists told a different story. What had seemed like harmless fun to him was not being received the way he had expected. Some of the people around him stared in shock, their eyes wide with disbelief, while others had already started pulling out their phones. The atmosphere, once light and carefree, suddenly felt tense. The royal guard, still unmoved by Daniel's actions, didn't flinch or make a sound. His expression remained calm and unreadable, which only made the situation feel more surreal to Daniel. He stood there for a moment, watching the guard's silence, thinking that maybe the whole thing would just blow over. After all, it was just a little paint, right? Nothing serious. But the people around him weren't so forgiving. A few murmured in disapproval, their voices rising as they shared their thoughts about what had just happened. The prank was not just a simple joke anymore. It was an insult. The royal guard wasn't just a man in a uniform. He represented something much more. He was part of a long tradition of discipline and respect that the local people held dear. What Daniel had done was seen as a disrespect to that tradition, and the crowd around him felt it deeply. As more people began to notice, the mood shifted dramatically. A few people stepped forward, their voices growing louder as they began to express their outrage. Some shook their heads in disbelief, while others started pointing at Daniel, murmuring about his arrogance. A couple of tourists, who had been recording the whole thing on their phones, began to upload the videos to social media. Within seconds, the images and videos of the incident began to spread online, reaching thousands of people in just a matter of minutes. The situation was quickly turning from a minor prank into a public spectacle. Daniel, still oblivious to the gravity of what he had done, tried to laugh it off, but his smile faded as he realized that the attention was now shifting toward him, and not in a way he had anticipated. People were looking at him with a mix of surprise, anger, and disbelief. What had seemed like a funny moment to him was now a full-blown controversy, with people around him becoming more vocal in their condemnation. The royal guard, though still silent, was not unaffected by the situation. As Daniel turned to leave, trying to escape the growing tension, the guard calmly walked toward a nearby officer, explaining what had happened. His voice was measured, and his demeanor was as composed as ever. But the people watching could see that something serious was unfolding. The local authorities were already on alert. The incident had gained enough attention that it could no longer be ignored. News outlets began picking up the story, and soon reports were flooding in about the wealthy tourist who had disrespected the royal guard. As the story spread across social media, it sparked outrage. People began discussing the prank online, with many expressing their anger over the disrespect shown to the guard, while others criticized the tourist's privilege. What Daniel had thought would be a harmless joke was now a source of national controversy. The rich tourist, who had once felt invincible in his world of wealth and status, was beginning to feel the weight of his actions. The more the story spread, the more he realized that his fun had come at a high cost. At that moment, Daniel's carefree attitude began to falter. What had once seemed like an innocent prank now felt like a mistake. But it was too late. The consequences of his actions were already beginning to take shape, and nothing could stop them from unraveling. As the news of Daniel's prank began to spread, the backlash grew stronger. What had seemed like a harmless joke to him was quickly turning into something far more serious. People all around the world were beginning to hear about the incident, and their reactions were anything but kind. On social media, the video of the royal guard covered in paint went viral, sparking outrage from people who felt that Daniel's actions were disrespectful to both the royal family and the country's proud traditions. The public's reaction was swift and intense. People began to voice their anger online, flooding social media with posts condemning the tourist for his behavior. The hashtags #RespectTheGuard and #HonorTradition were shared thousands of times. Some people even suggested boycotting the businesses owned by Daniel's family. The videos of the incident were everywhere, with many sharing their disgust at the young tourist's actions. What Daniel had thought would be a moment of amusement had now become a global spectacle, with people from all walks of life expressing their disapproval. At first, Daniel didn't take the online criticism seriously. He had always been able to avoid consequences due to his wealth and status. His family was powerful, and he had often been shielded from any real trouble. But now, for the first time, he felt like he was losing control of the situation. The comments became more personal, with many attacking his character, calling him arrogant and disrespectful. His social media accounts, once filled with glamorous photos and attention from fans, were now flooded with angry comments, making it impossible for him to ignore the growing storm around him. The local authorities, who had initially hesitated, were now under pressure to take action. It wasn't just a prank anymore. It was a national issue. The public had made it clear that Daniel's actions had gone too far, and now the authorities had to decide whether to press charges. The royal family, who had remained silent at first, issued a statement condemning the prank. They described the action as an insult to the royal guard, to the national heritage, and to the very values that their family stood for. The statement made it clear that the royal family would not tolerate such disrespect. Daniel's family, once a symbol of wealth and power, was beginning to feel the weight of the situation. The business deals they had worked so hard to secure were now in jeopardy. Some clients were already pulling out, unwilling to be associated with a family whose son had embarrassed them in such a public way. The social circles that Daniel had once moved in were shrinking as well. People who had once praised him for his success now whispered about his behavior behind closed doors. His reputation, which had once been untouchable, was now in ruins. Daniel's friends, who had encouraged him to act boldly, began to distance themselves. Some of them tried to reassure him, saying that everything would blow over. But deep down, they knew the damage had been done. The media continued to report on the incident, with each new story highlighting just how far-reaching the consequences were. What Daniel had thought was a small, innocent prank had now become a full-blown scandal, and he was at the center of it. As the pressure mounted, Daniel started to realize the true cost of his actions. The luxury and privilege he had once taken for granted no longer seemed so secure. The once carefree young man now found himself at the center of a situation he couldn't escape. He had underestimated how much his prank would affect not just his life, but the lives of those around him. The consequences were no longer something that could be laughed off. The investigation into Daniel's actions had quickly become more than just a matter of public opinion. It had turned into an official legal matter. As the days passed, the situation worsened for him. The authorities, after carefully reviewing the evidence and the growing public outcry, decided that charges would be pressed. It wasn't just about a harmless joke anymore. It was about the disrespect shown to an important national symbol, the Royal Guard. The charges, which initially seemed like an overreaction to Daniel, now felt real and unavoidable. Daniel's family, who had always been able to smooth over any troubles in the past, found themselves scrambling to protect their son. They had always relied on their connections to avoid any serious consequences, but this situation was different. The royal family had made it clear that they would not tolerate the prank, and the authorities were under pressure to act decisively. Daniel, who had once been so confident in his ability to handle any problem with money or influence, now felt helpless. The legal proceedings were moving quickly. The paint on the Royal Guard's uniform was more than just a mess. It was a sign of disrespect to the entire nation, and the public demanded justice. Daniel's family hired a top-notch legal team to defend him, but even they were aware that this case was going to be difficult to win. The national attention was too great, and the consequences of Daniel's actions were too significant to ignore. As the trial date drew closer, Daniel's anxiety grew. He was used to getting what he wanted with little effort, but now, everything seemed to be slipping through his fingers. His lawyers tried to downplay the incident, claiming it was a harmless prank from a young man who didn't understand the cultural importance of the Royal Guard. But the prosecution was relentless. They painted Daniel as an arrogant tourist who thought his wealth and status could shield him from the consequences of his behavior. Outside the courtroom, the media circus continued. News stations followed every development closely, and the public eagerly awaited the outcome of the trial. Some people continued to defend Daniel, arguing that he hadn't meant any harm. But the majority of the public saw the situation as an insult to their traditions and values. The outrage was so widespread that even the wealth and status of Daniel's family couldn't protect him from the growing backlash. The family's business empire, once thriving and expanding, now began to suffer. Clients who had once been eager to work with them began to reconsider their relationships. Deals that had been in the works for months or even years were suddenly canceled. Even some of the family's closest associates began to distance themselves. The once respected name that Daniel's family had worked so hard to build was now being dragged through the mud. Daniel's parents, who had always been so proud of their son, were now faced with the harsh reality that his actions had consequences far beyond what they could have imagined. The pressure was taking a toll on everyone, but especially on Daniel. He was no longer the carefree young man who had arrived in the city just a few weeks ago. He was now a man on trial, not only for his actions, but for his very reputation. As the trial loomed closer, Daniel began to realize the depth of his mistake. What he had thought would be a small, inconsequential joke had turned into a legal battle that threatened to ruin everything he had ever known. The consequences were far greater than he had imagined, and there was no way to undo the damage. The day of the trial finally arrived, and Daniel felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had been through tough situations before, but nothing like this. As he stood in front of the courthouse, he was no longer the confident young man who thought the world was at his feet. The eyes of the public were all on him now, and he could feel the weight of their judgment. His family had spent a lot of money on the best legal team they could find, but he still didn't know if it would be enough to save him from the consequences of his actions. The courtroom was packed. Reporters from all over the world filled the seats, cameras flashing as they captured every moment. The air was tense, as everyone knew that this trial was going to be highly publicized. People were eager to see whether Daniel would be held accountable for his prank. He had no idea what to expect, but deep down, he knew this was the moment where everything could change. The prosecution was relentless. They argued that Daniel's actions were not just a simple joke, but an act of disrespect that couldn't be overlooked. They painted the situation as an insult not just to the royal guard, but to the entire nation. The royal family had made their stance clear, and the public had rallied behind them. The prosecution made it clear that Daniel's wealth and status shouldn't shield him from the law. They called witnesses, including some of the people who had been present during the prank, all of whom described the incident as shocking and offensive. Daniel's defense team tried to downplay the seriousness of the prank. They argued that Daniel had not intended to cause harm and that it was a mistake made in the heat of the moment. They painted him as a young man who had simply misjudged the situation, not realizing the gravity of his actions. They emphasized his family's reputation and their contributions to the community, hoping to sway the court's opinion. But as the trial progressed, it became clear that the public's outrage had already played a major role in shaping the case. The more they tried to explain away Daniel's behavior, the more the evidence pointed to the fact that his actions had gone too far. The videos, the media coverage, and the public's response all painted a picture that couldn't be ignored. Daniel had crossed a line, and now he had to face the consequences. Throughout the trial, Daniel sat quietly, listening to the arguments on both sides. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of everything that was happening. How had he gone from a carefree tourist to a defendant in a high-profile case? His heart sank as he realized that this was no longer something he could laugh off. His actions had not just embarrassed him, they had damaged his family's reputation, and there was no easy way out. When it was his turn to speak, Daniel stood up, his voice shaky. He tried to apologize, explaining that he never intended to cause harm, that it was a prank gone wrong. But his words felt hollow, and the faces in the courtroom were not forgiving. Some looked at him with sympathy, but most could only see a young man who had made a poor decision and now had to face the consequences of that mistake. As the trial drew to a close, the weight of the situation was clear to everyone in the room. The judge would make his decision soon, but no one knew what the outcome would be. Daniel's future was now uncertain, and the life he had known was quickly slipping away. The days following the trial were filled with uncertainty and mounting pressure. Daniel was no longer the carefree young man who had arrived in the city just weeks ago. His entire world seemed to be crumbling around him. What had started as a simple prank had spiraled into a national scandal, and the weight of the consequences was now becoming too much to bear. Despite the legal team's best efforts, the public sentiment was clear. People were angry. The media had followed every twist and turn of the trial, and now the story seemed to have taken on a life of its own. News outlets continued to run headlines about the young tourist who had disrespected the royal guard, with every report highlighting the outrage and the damage he had caused. What had once seemed like a moment of harmless fun was now being discussed in the same breath as serious offenses against tradition and national pride. For Daniel, the fallout was immediate. His family's business empire, which had once been thriving, began to show the first signs of trouble. Clients who had long been loyal to the family started pulling away, unwilling to be associated with the scandal. Some businesses canceled contracts, while others put future projects on hold. The wealth and power that Daniel had always relied on suddenly felt fragile. He couldn't understand how quickly things were falling apart. Even within his own circle, people who had once been close friends began to distance themselves. His social media, once filled with pictures of glamorous vacations and luxury, now looked like a battlefield. The comments were brutal, angry, mocking, and unforgiving. The messages flooded in, some calling him a fool, others accusing him of being out of touch with the world around him. He couldn't escape the flood of negativity. His phone buzzed constantly, and with each message, the weight of his mistake seemed to grow heavier. As the pressure continued to build, Daniel tried to focus on what he could control. He spent long hours with his family's lawyers, trying to figure out how to repair the damage that had been done. But even his legal team was running out of solutions. The damage to his reputation seemed irreparable, and the family's name, once held in high regard, was now being dragged through the mud. One evening, Daniel sat alone in his room, staring at the piles of paperwork and legal documents. The weight of everything that had happened felt unbearable. He had never imagined that a single moment of carelessness could change his entire life. As he reflected on the prank, he realized how naive he had been. He had thought his wealth and status could shield him from any consequences, but now he understood just how wrong he had been. The stress began to take its toll on him. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. His once energetic attitude had given way to exhaustion and frustration. He wanted to take it all back, to go back in time and undo the damage. But it was too late. The paint on the Royal Guard's uniform had left a permanent mark, and no amount of money or influence could erase the consequences. In the quiet moments, when the noise of the world seemed to fade away, Daniel realized that the path he had once walked, one of privilege and ease, was no longer open to him. He had lost more than just his reputation. He had lost the carefree life he had always known. Now he was faced with the long road of rebuilding, not just his family's business, but his own sense of responsibility and self-worth. As weeks went by, the pressure on Daniel continued to mount. The harsh reality of his situation began to set in. It was clear that the road ahead was going to be long and difficult, and Daniel knew that no amount of money or status could simply erase the damage he had caused. The scandal had torn apart his once carefree life, and his reputation was now marred by the prank he had thought would be harmless. But amidst the chaos and the growing public anger, Daniel began to change. In the quiet of his room, away from the judgmental eyes of the world, he started to reflect on his actions. He realized that he had taken so much for granted, that his wealth and status had blinded him to the impact of his behavior on others. He had treated the Royal Guard as nothing more than a prop for his amusement, not realizing that he was disrespecting not just an individual, but an entire tradition that meant a great deal to the people of the country. For the first time, Daniel felt a deep sense of regret. The pride he once felt in his wealth and power began to feel hollow. What good was all the money and status if it came at the cost of his dignity? He had hurt others, and now he had to face the consequences, not just legally, but in his own heart. He had never truly understood the meaning of respect until now. Daniel decided to take a step that no one had expected. He reached out to the Royal Guard, the very person he had disrespected. It wasn't an easy decision. The embarrassment and shame he felt made it hard for him to even write the words, but he knew it was the right thing to do. He sent a letter, a simple apology, acknowledging the harm he had caused and expressing how deeply sorry he was. He admitted that he had been foolish, that he had never considered the gravity of his actions, and that he was committed to making amends. In the letter, Daniel also shared how much the incident had changed him. He explained how the consequences of his actions had led him to reflect on his behavior, and how he now understood the importance of tradition and respect. He didn't expect forgiveness, but he hoped that, in time, the guard would see that he was genuinely remorseful. When the letter was sent, Daniel didn't know what would happen next. Would the royal guard accept his apology? Would the public continue to see him as nothing more than an arrogant fool? He had no way of knowing, but he understood that whatever happened, he had to face the truth of his actions and take responsibility. In the meantime, Daniel worked to rebuild his family's reputation. His parents, too, were deeply affected by what had happened, and they began to focus on restoring their business. But Daniel realized that the journey to repair his own life would be a much more personal one. He knew that he had lost something irreplaceable: his sense of innocence. The carefree days of living without thinking about consequences were gone. But, in a way, he understood now that this was not necessarily a bad thing. It was the first step toward becoming a more thoughtful and responsible person. As the months went by, Daniel began to see the long-term effects of his actions. Though the world had moved on from the scandal, the lesson he had learned would stay with him forever. The royal guard never responded to his letter, and Daniel wasn't sure if that meant forgiveness or simply indifference. Still, he found peace in knowing he had done the right thing by reaching out. It was a small step in the process of mending the harm he had caused, but it was an important one for his own growth. His family's business, while still recovering, slowly began to bounce back. Deals were once again on the table, and some clients, who had initially distanced themselves, started to return. The process was slow, but it was progress. Yet Daniel knew that the road to regaining his family's full reputation wasn't a quick fix. It would take years of consistent work, honesty, and humility to restore what had been damaged. In the time since the incident, Daniel had also learned a lot about himself. The once careless, privileged young man who saw the world as a stage for his amusement had slowly transformed into someone more thoughtful and aware of the impact of his actions. He began taking his responsibilities more seriously and started to focus on making a positive difference, both in his personal life and in his family's business. Daniel started to volunteer for local charities, helping to support causes he had once overlooked. He began working on projects that mattered to the community, aiming to give back in ways he had never considered before. His approach to life became more grounded, less focused on material wealth and status, and more on creating genuine connections with others. Although his actions couldn't undo the past, Daniel found new ways to build trust with those around him. People began to notice the change in him. Friends who had once abandoned him started to reach out, acknowledging the growth they saw in him. While it didn't erase the past, it helped Daniel feel that he was on the path to redemption. He no longer saw his wealth as a shield to protect him from consequences. Instead, he saw it as a tool to help others and make amends where he could. Daniel had learned that personal growth wasn't just about avoiding mistakes. It was about facing them head-on and learning from them. The incident with the royal guard, though a painful and embarrassing chapter of his life, had been the turning point that sparked this transformation. It had forced him to confront his own flaws, understand the weight of his actions, and realize the importance of respecting others, regardless of their status or role in society. Looking back, Daniel knew that he would never be the same person he once was. He had lost a lot during that period: the respect of others, his carefree lifestyle, and his once untouchable reputation. But in the end, he had gained something even more valuable: a deeper understanding of what it meant to be accountable, to grow, and to live with integrity. The paint on the Royal Guard's uniform had once been a symbol of his careless arrogance, but now it was a reminder of the journey he had undertaken to become a better person. And though the past would always be a part of him, Daniel was determined to make sure that his future would be defined by the lessons he had learned, not by the mistakes he had made.